In this video, we'll start learning about how psychologists classify and study personalities. First, let's define what we mean by personality. Personality is a person's distinct and relatively enduring characteristic style of behaving, thinking, and feeling. So psychologists researching personality will focus on individual differences between people. They're also looking for consistency or predictability in these characters. They're not looking for changes in mood, for example. So personality researchers are focusing on the internal factors that drive behavior. This is compared to social psychologists who would focus on external factors or environmental factors. There are many different theories that have been proposed to describe how personalities develop or form. Some of these include psychoanalytic, humanistic, social cognitive, trait, but there are others. In general, when we talk about personality theories, they address 4 different questions. First, where does personality come from? Second, when does personality develop? Third, is personality stable or changing? And fourth, does personality predict behavior? If you do a Google search for personality psychologists, you might see results like this, which is a problem. The whiteness and maleness is overwhelming. So when we study personality theories, we should make sure that we're aware of this potentially limited perspective. So now we'll talk in a bit more detail about one of these personality theories, psychoanalytic theory. This is the first comprehensive theory of personality that addressed those 4 questions we just went through. And this is the theory that Freud proposed, that many of you have probably heard mentioned before. So one disclaimer here about the word theory. We're going to discuss Freud's theories as just that, theories. But the term theory that we're using is not the same as the one that we use when we're talking about scientific theories like those in biology. A scientific theory is an overarching framework that's testable and supported by an abundance of empirical evidence. Here we're using a more colloquial use of the word theory since Freud's claims can't be tested empirically. We'll talk more about this later. We're going to work through 4 main elements of Freud's psychoanalytic theory. First, this theory claims that the levels of awareness of the mind are mostly unconscious. We can look at the mind like an iceberg, where most of it is hidden beneath the surface. So here I'm drawing out an iceberg, and the part that pokes up above the surface, that's going to be our conscious mind. Here, this is the iceberg, this is the surface of the ocean. And this part here where light can get to but is still underwater is called our preconscious mind, and the part that's completely underwater in the dark, light can't reach, is our unconscious mind. So our conscious mind is associated with our present awareness. Our preconscious mind, this part here, is outside our awareness, but it's accessible. And our unconscious mind is outside our awareness and not accessible. So according to Freud and how we've depicted it here, the preconscious and unconscious mind dominate. And Freud says that the mind is in constant conflict between these conscious processes at the top of the iceberg poking out of the water and these unconscious processes. And the take-home from this framework is that mental processes are fundamentally unconscious. We're going to talk about some limitations of Freud's work in a little bit, but this is one key contribution that he made to our modern-day understanding. And in fact, this idea that the brain is driven by unconscious processes is what's led to these fields of cognitive psychology and neuroscience that we know about today. The next part of Freud's framework that we're going to talk about are the 3 different parts of the mind that he describes and how they interact. These are the id, ego, and superego. The id is responsible for our instinctual drives that lead us to seek pleasure, to survive, and to be aggressive in doing so. And so the id here is completely found in our unconscious mind. I'm drawing this on the iceberg. And the id would say, I want to do that now, this instinct for instant gratification. The superego, on the other hand, is the part of the mind that tells us how we should behave. So we can draw our superego up here on our iceberg, and this is spanning our conscious, preconscious, and unconscious minds. The superego might say, it's not right to do that. And finally, the third part of the mind described by Freud is the ego. And the ego, he claimed, finds balance in the internal mental conflict between the id and the superego. So here I'm drawing the ego here that also spans the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious mind. And I'll shade these in to show you where these parts are a little bit better. And the ego might say, maybe we can find a compromise between the id and the superego. So the id and the superego are in conflict, and that conflict is resolved or is attempted to be resolved by the ego. These parts of the mind develop at different times, and Freud said that the id was present at birth. The ego developed at about 3 years of age. This is when we see judgment and tolerance and self-control emerge, and this ego emerges to check the id. And then at 5 years old, we see the superego develop, and this is when we develop a sense of morality. According to Freud, when none of the 3 parts of the mind dominate, that is what results in a healthy personality. But if one dominates the other 3, then that leads to a personality disorder. So let's talk through an example. Let's say we've got a nice piece of chocolate cake, maybe a little raspberry filling. The id's going to say, I want that cake now. I want to eat that. The instinctual impulsive drive for pleasure. The superego is going to say, you can't have the cake. It's too unhealthy. The ego then is going to try to find a compromise and will say, you can have the cake if you work out tomorrow to make up for it. So the conflict between the id and the superego in this case is resolved by the ego. This conflict often leads to defense mechanisms, and these are behavioral strategies that are adopted to restrain the impulse of the id. For these to be considered defense mechanisms, these have to be unconsciously selected. And we'll work through some examples of these defense mechanisms in class to figure out a little bit more about them. So we've covered 2 aspects of Freud's framework, looking at the mind being primarily driven by unconscious forces, and we've looked at these 3 different parts of the mind that are interacting. So how does all of this come together for personality development, which is our focus here? Freud proposed the psychosexual stage theory of personality development. This claims that the early childhood experience has an impact on the unconscious, and this impact stays around throughout our lives. He described 5 stages of development throughout childhood, and at each, the id's pleasure-seeking energy is focused on a different body part or erogenous zone. So let's just quickly go through the different stages of development proposed by Freud that comprise the psychosexual stage theory. At birth, from 0 to 18 months of age, we see individuals in the oral stage, where the erogenous zone of the id's focus is the mouth or thumb. So we talk about an obsession with oral stimulation, and this is relieved through interaction with the mother's breast during nursing and also with the baby's own body through sucking on the thumb. The anal stage, which we see from 18 to 36 months of age, we see the energy focused on the anus, and the target of this energy is the baby's own body and exploration of the body, in particular the anus. The phallic stage, from 3 to 6 years of age, the erogenous zone of focus for the id is the genitals, and in this case that energy is focused for boys on the mother and for girls on the father. And so we see that tighter relationships form between a child and its opposite sex parent. And this, according to Freud, is due to this phallic stage of personality development. And then the child enters the latency stage, which we see from about 6 years of age and lasting until puberty. Here the id has no targeted erogenous zone, and sexual energy is largely repressed. And then finally we have the genital stage, which occurs from puberty and on. And here we see that the erogenous zone, the target of the id's pleasure-seeking energy, is the genital region. But now the target of this energy is one's sexual partner. So Freud says that conflict occurs at each of these stages, and if it's resolved, that's positive for the personality, good for the personality. But if it's unresolved, that leads to a fixation. So it could lead to an oral fixation, for example, if there's conflict in that oral stage that's unresolved. The 4th and final main take-home point from Freud's work is his development of psychoanalysis. And this is a therapeutic approach that he developed to unlock unconscious thought processes and release them. We're going to talk more about this when we talk about therapy later in the course. So let's summarize Freud's contributions to our knowledge base. He was the first person to propose how personality develops, and we saw that earlier in his psychosexual stage theory of personality development. He also showed us the importance of childhood in personality development. He drew attention to the idea that many important mental processes are outside of our conscious awareness. And he brought mainstream attention to the field of psychology, which before his time was a bit isolated from the general public. But there are some problems with placing his work in the context of psychological science. So let's look at some limitations. First, his work is not empirically supported, and this is particularly important because psychology has turned to a scientific approach to the study of the mind and behavior. His work ignores broad social context and the impact of cultural forces. His work is embedded in white, affluent male beliefs, which we've seen as an issue with other findings in the field of psychology. And his framework is not super useful in predicting future behavior, and that's something that we want a personality framework or theory to do. And finally, his work reduces people to instincts, and this removes people's freedom, their choice, and their responsibility for their own actions. And this, if taken literally, might have serious consequences. So that summarizes Freud's framework for describing the mind and personality development. Coming up in class, we'll dig into these defense mechanisms, as I mentioned, and we'll also look at other personality theories. In particular, we'll look at the trait theory, and we'll compare that to Freud's framework. So up here, this trait theory is something we're going to look at.